Hey, Eric, great to see you again. As our viewers know, I've been in conversation with you over the past, over a year now. It's been just talking about changes that are happening in the cannabis space. As everybody knows, and kind of following us on LinkedIn, my name is Anand Shahi. I'm the president of the bar entities, including entities like SparkNett, where we'll publish this, as well as being CFO for Nova Farms. And really just love catching up with you both at conferences, like we saw each other at Benzinga in
Yeah.
Miami not too long ago, but also over conversations like this where we get to kind of discuss what's happening in real time in this industry that's evolving, very fast after a lot of incremental slow changes over the past, let's say, decade plus that have happened. If you could, just for our viewers or some people who might be new to this, could you give a quick background about yourself and then we'll just start talking about what's happening?
I'd be happy to, and thank you for having me on. It's nice to see you again and to speak with you. So, I am Eric Berlin. I am the leader of the cannabis sector group, both in the US and globally for Dentons, which is the largest law firm in the world. I have been a lawyer for over 30 years and in the cannabis space now for over 15 years. I was the lawyer who helped craft and get passed the Illinois medical cannabis law. I was then brought in to help rewrite the Ohio medical cannabis law and get that passed. And basically, for the last decade, have spent all of my time for clients in or impacted by the cannabis or hemp industries.
That's great. That's great. And what a distinguished kind of timeline you've had in the space and help shape both at the local, state level as well as the federal level. I was looking back at when we last formally did this conversation. It was about 7 months ago. And that's when the news first broke. And people don't realize in cannabis, your experience is about 7x, however much time you've spent in it.
Yeah.
But on the regulatory landscape, it's probably 1/7 in terms of the timeline because everything takes longer to kind of do and get processed. So tell us what this recent news was last week that came out regarding the DEA and what are kind of the expectations now since the first news broke up until about 7 months in time has taken place to get the DEA to this point where there's more news coming out. But please tell us what that news meant. Does it imply certain things? Does it not imply other things? Because everybody's got an expectation now of what might come next.
Yeah. Yes, there is a lot of misunderstanding or miscommunications going on around this. So I'll do my best to straighten that out. What occurred was that the DEA sent its recommendation for proposed rules to the White House Office of Management and Budget. Uh, OMB is in the executive branch and basically oversees what agencies are doing to make sure they're compliant with administrative law and consistent with the president's mission, really. So that's precisely what happened, but let me put that all in context for you. The president, um, almost 2 years ago now, issued his executive order ordering federal expungements, ordering states to participate in that, and ordering the Department of Health and Human Services and Attorney General to work expeditiously to review the scheduling of marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug. And I think the administrative order and everything made it clear that the president had deep concerns as to whether marijuana should still be a Schedule 1 drug, given what we know now. And so that process is taking a while. It starts with the FDA. The FDA is part of Health and Human Services, and the FDA has to review the substance and review all the medical and scientific data about the substance to determine whether that substance has and I'm going to vastly shorten all of this, right? There are all sorts of aspects to looking at this, but basically what the FDA does is says, does this substance have a commonly accepted medical use in the United States? And If it does, what's the risk of abuse? What's the risk of public harm? And that determines the scheduling. And just so we're very clear on what this all means, under the Controlled Substances Act, there are 5 schedules for controlled substances. There are also many substances that are not controlled in the United States. For example, Epidiolex containing CBD is no longer a controlled substance. It started at Schedule 5 and now is no longer controlled. As far as the substances that are controlled, Schedule 1 is reserved for substances that are basically dangerous, but most important, have no medical use. They're deemed to have no medical use and they stay on Schedule 1. If that substance has any medical use, but is deemed to be the most dangerous, the highest risk of abuse, the substance goes on Schedule 2. And then 2 through 5 all have some medical use, but the difference is on the risk of abuse. And the drug, there's not a good test for that. The drug basically, or the substance, sits in the schedule that its risk of abuse is most similar to. And so what the what the FDA did last year is transmit its recommendation, its finding on these standards to the DEA. A redacted copy was made public, and eventually a mostly unredacted copy was made public. And I know this is, I hope this is useful, Anand, just to explain kind of how we get to the DEA. So that recommendation was issued on a Friday night. I sat down and read it. It was fascinating. And in some ways, it was a blinding glimpse of the obvious for anyone who's ever used cannabis or anyone who's ever experienced someone using cannabis. They basically found that, well, cannabis makes you feel hungry and then makes you feel sleepy. That was like, people know that already. But what this really importantly found was the FDA found that based on all the data available, that cannabis, marijuana, as it's defined under the Controlled Substances Act, has commonly accepted medical uses in the United States. And the FDA found that for anorexia and pain and nausea and vomiting associated with other conditions. The FDA commented on some other conditions like inflammatory bowel disease and said, it certainly looks like it helps, but we're not yet at the point that we're making that conclusion. But they did make the conclusion for anorexia, pain, and nausea and vomiting. And so if you've ever gone through chemotherapy for cancer, and used marijuana to bring down the nausea and to give you an appetite. You already know that, but the FDA has now validated that. The FDA also found that marijuana, cannabis, has a lower risk of abuse than Schedule 1 drugs and many Schedule 2 drugs. So they particularly pointed to heroin and fentanyl, but interestingly also pointed to alcohol and nicotine, and said, notably, they're not controlled substances, but it's notable that cannabis has a substantial lower risk of abuse than any of these other substances. And the FDA concluded that cannabis, marijuana as it's defined, should be on Schedule 3. And what we know from the reports that have been issued is that the DEA accepted that recommendation and has transmitted that recommendation to OMB, which now has, from the point of transmission, 90 days to, so we ought to get onto timeline as well, but it has OMB has 90 days to review and get back to the DEA now. Let me just pause on kind of bringing us to date, and then we can look at the timeline moving forward to see if you have any questions on that.
Sure. Yeah, so very interesting points. First of all, congratulations to everybody in the industry for, anybody who's been in it for, at least the close to the past decade or 2 or 3, that finally have validation that it is not as addictive as alcohol, which has no apparent medical use. from my understanding anyways, correct me if I'm wrong, and is not regulated. But now you've kind of identified some of the uses that the government has looked at the data from, probably not much coming from the US because it's been very limited, but has come to this conclusion. So I just wanted to remark that that's quite an achievement for the industry. In terms of the actual application of this timeline now, as you mentioned, the DEA has kind of finished its review from recommendations from the FDA. Now it's going to the Office of the OMB. They have 90 days to respond. Obviously, there's a lot of churning cogs here in the government that have to transform the positioning of the government from, hey, we need to block this as if it's fentanyl or heroin, to, hey, we need to kind of rethink how we're going to treat this. And that's where a lot of the questions I've been asking, what questions should I ask Eric when I talk to him? And a lot of the questions have been around, number one, what is that timeline that is ahead? Is it going to be achievable this year, right? And there's a few questions that stem from that. And kind of number two, and maybe you could do number two first, actually, is what are because they're tied together, what are the government agencies, what do they need to do next to come out with a coherent federal level policy around this topic of rescheduling? Because it's not, and with all due respect to the government, there's a lot of functioning pieces and complexity there, and changing of policies and procedures. And I can't even imagine how many government employees and agents would be affected by this as well. So could you walk us through that and then connect it to the timeline that we should expect coming next?
I'd be happy to. Let me actually address all three things that you said, starting with, this is extremely affirming. I mean, it was amazing to sit and read that FDA recommendation. And, for folks who are patients and believed in this, it's very affirming. At the same time, I don't look to the federal government for validation of what I'm doing. So for all the obvious reasons. Let me talk about both of the timeline and government agencies involved, and sort of combine them.
Sure.
So at this point, the DEA has transmitted its recommendation, what it plans to do, to OMB. OMB has 90 days, and OMB sits in the White House, it's part of the White House, has 90 days to get back to DEA. I do not expect OMB to take 90 days on this. I mean, the president has ordered this to be done in an expeditious fashion. And so I'm hopeful that OMB isn't going to take that time, because they recognize that they want to get this done. They could, though, and so that could affect the timeline. OMB sends back to DEA, depending on what OMB says, assuming OMB has, we approve this, go forward. The DEA then issues its notice of proposed rulemaking. And I expect the DEA to include not just a rule that moves marijuana as it's defined from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, because that's easy enough. What they also need to do, they meaning the DEA, is promulgate rules that will keep us in compliance with the single convention, the UN treaty. And that means that that marijuana as a Schedule 3 drug will still need to comply with anti-diversion, traveling through the DEA. Basically, the DEA makes the sale and controls the sale of the marijuana from the bulk manufacturer. To be clear, the DEA registered bulk manufacturer. And the DEA will still set quotas, just as examples, right? So there need to be rules, regulations promulgated on that. The DEA will do that upon hearing back from OMB. And then there is a notice and comment period. So the notice is given, and there's a 60-day, normally 60-day. We've seen situations where it's limited to 30, but it's normally a 60-day comment period, and then there can be hearings. So within 30 days of the rule being issued, so 30 days within the notice of promulgation of rule, folks need to ask for hearings. Now, I mean, we don't need to speculate and guess, right? I mean, we know that there will be requests for hearings here. It's too big an issue. And so the decision as to whether to hold hearings is within the DEA, but what normally happens is the administrative law judge has the hearings, and that is really the unknown in timing, right? I mean, I spent a couple decades as a litigator prior to spending all my time in cannabis, and I can't remember an instance where something significant happened in a month. Right? I mean, of course, I went into court on TROs and preliminary injunctions, and maybe something happened. But in terms of like actually having hearings and going forward, and then having that administrative law judge formulate a recommendation to the administrator, and the administrator has to consider that, and they need to respond to comments. That gets us into the question prior to getting into like what then happens is just the pure timing of how long will this take. And so
Right.
let's talk about that a moment. Let's say OMB comes back. Let's say they come back this week, right? Although I don't think that's going to happen. So let's say they come back by the end of May.
Right.
Just use that. Please, no one hold me to that. I don't know when it's going to be. I'm just saying that for purposes of a hypothetical. That they come back by the end of May. You then have 2 months for comment period. Let's say you don't start hearings until June, July. Are you really going to have full hearings in August? Right? Does that happen? I mean, it's hard to get things done in the government in August.
Right.
And it's not like they just happen like that, right? So, I mean, maybe you're looking at hearings in September or October. I think you see where I'm going. I think it's difficult to get this done by the election, to issue a final rule. I think it's possible. It's possible. It can happen. But if I were to have to put my money on it, I'm skeptical that we'll have a final rule by the election. Regardless of what happens in the election, within reason, Biden will continue to be our president during those additional months, and perhaps that happens during those additional months. The concern is that Trump wins the election, or someone like Trump wins the election and goes in and reverses anything that's happened, which is kind of what happened before. And this would be one of them, right? This could be a situation where I'm just like speaking purely hypothetically here. So I don't want anyone to like lose it on this.
Sure.
But Trump wins the election. He appoints Scott Pruitt as administrator of the DEA, right?
Right.
Director of the DEA. And he decides to take this down, basically just stop it, or just take forever on it, right? Like bury it the way the DEA has done in the past with petitions to reschedule. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm just saying that that's within the realm of possibility.
Sure.
That happens. Surely there will be lawsuits, there will be everything about that. I'm just saying that that's within the realm of possibility, and what we industry folks are hoping to avoid. We would hope that the DEA's recommendation becomes a final rule. And why do we hope that happens? Well, I mean, of course, folks really hope that marijuana, as it's defined under the Controlled Substances Act, gets descheduled. And there are various different viewpoints on that, but I would like to see the federal government legalize and regulate the industry in ways that are different than how it would be as a Schedule III drug. But in terms of what the DEA, the FDA, and the DEA reasonably could do under these circumstances, probably the most likely and reasonable conclusion was going to be Schedule III. Let's be clear on what that means, though.
Sure.
And here we get a little bit into, who's involved and what that means. As a Schedule 3 substance, few things. Number one, it doesn't mean that marijuana is prescribable immediately.
Right.
You have to go through all sorts of FDA testing to come up with, the substance that's going to become either a drug or a dietary supplement or that sort of thing. It's a whole process. You can't have doctors immediately. There are mechanisms to do that, but they're difficult. I'm just saying as a general matter, it's not like I could go to my doctor and get a script for, sour diesel from
Right.
my pharmacy. That's just not how it's going to work. And similarly, the state legal operators do not become legal because marijuana gets rescheduled to 3. And they're not likely to, because the DEA is not going to register a company that's simultaneously violating federal law. So there's difficulty there.
So
You
let's
look
talk.
like, go ahead.
Yeah, let's talk more about that topic because you mentioned DEA quotas earlier. So let's say, for example, a multi-state operator in the Northeast has complied with all state and local laws, is operating and growing in that footprint. And now rescheduling happens. And just to summarize what you were saying before, rescheduling could happen as early as January, let's say, if we are switching presidents and Biden's able to kind of sign the DEA recommendations and all the other pieces that you mentioned happen to flow through,
Yeah.
or it could happen, potentially later or get slowed down. But
One
let's
thing I want to mention, and I'll let you finish, is I didn't discuss in the timing lawsuits and how that could impact,
sure.
and we can circle back to that later.
And certainly there could be many lawsuits, and it could be related to this topic that we're talking about, which is the DEA getting involved, and then how that's going to impact the MSOs in the industries and the other participants in the industry, small or large, that have been compliant with state law, but have not obviously been compliant with federal law because there was no clear federal law on this topic, and obviously it's changing at this point. So it was adverse before, and now it's in the rescheduling phase. So could you talk about how that happens? How do you interact with the DEA, and how does that get implemented between the state legal operators that have been in existence, and now this federal piece that's going to come in?
The DEA's view is that they'll be on separate rails. That you will have bulk manufacturers of cannabis that are DEA registered. They already exist, companies like Bright Green, and there are others, and the DEA has indicated they're going to add some. And so the DEA's view is that there is the DEA supply of marijuana that's grown by the bulk manufacturers, controlled by the DEA, moves from maybe those who are growing to other manufacturers, manufacturing particular products, to researchers, DEA registered researchers. And those researchers can do the normal sorts of research that can be done, and eventually there can be particular drugs and clinical trials. All of that exists under the DEA's control and observation. And then on the other hand, you have the state legal operators who are selling medical marijuana where licensed by state law, and selling for adult use where licensed by state law. And the DEA's view under federal law is that those folks are continuing to violate federal law because they are not DEA registered. And that's an issue of enforcement, right? The full expectation is that the DEA is going to have its DEA controlled supply and research and development, and it's not going to enforce against the state legal operators, and basically wait for Congress eventually to step in and regulate them in some fashion, because the notion of, there's not the money or political will to shut down the state legal industries,
Right.
at least right now. And so the DA's view is they operate on totally separate rails, and they could enforce against that second state legal rail, but are choosing not to.
Very interesting. So that's a big point because I don't think people understand that. So it's almost like there's a new regime being created at the federal level which you have to be registered through the DEA. How do you think or speculate? Because I don't think there's a lot of guidance on this already, but perhaps there is that you're aware of. How does the DEA decide who gets to be part of that program and who doesn't? Is it a certain size issue? Is it a new application? Can people who are state legal also apply for participation there, or they would cut that off because they want to kind of parallel lines almost,
Yeah.
where they're not enforcing against the other, just given what has been allowed by the majority of states in the country. But they're now cherry picking who they get to be, who gets to be part of the DEA line of things. And when you mention lawsuits, I can't think of a bigger reason for lawsuits that might come up down the line, other than the DEA picking and choosing who those people are, and
Yeah.
who got to decide those, those factors.
So the DEA originally expanded its registration from the University of Mississippi to other bulk manufacturers because it was essentially ordered to. And there were regulations put out that it was going to do this. Congress ordered that. And there were a whole host of companies that had applied along the way, both historically, years earlier, and at an increased volume when the DEA said it was going to register additional bulk manufacturers. It went, there's a specific process to apply, and there are specific standards that the DEA considers. In many ways, most important to the DEA is diversion control. They want to make sure that their supply is like really tight.
Right.
And it considered companies that are able to do that. I don't know exactly all of the DEA's considerations, but I know that there are applications to do it. And I helped one company do that application, and that company won the application or was awarded the registration. And there are others that are there. There are several state legal cannabis companies that applied. And what the DEA said at that time is they are not going to register any company that's simultaneously violating federal law. You need to, particularly in the area that's relevant to what they'd be doing for the federal government. And it's continued to say that. That said, I do think there are potential opportunities for, you mentioned MSOs to become part of the bulk manufacturing. But I mean, that's a fairly nuanced legal issue that I'd have to get hired for
Sure.
to disclose. But I think there are ways of doing that, and I actually think it's really important that companies are thinking about, let's put it this way, recognizing that there are a whole host of different ways that cannabis and cannabinoids are going to go to market. And there is the state legal operators, and we're all most focused on the state legal operations because that's where most of the revenue is right now.
Sure.
And it's interesting.
And that's
The, the,
where
se- the
most of the
second
knowledge
is the,
is as well, in terms of growing the cannabis, and doing it in scale. That's where most of the experience is as well at this point. So,
right.
so
Other than what's referred to as legacy market, and
right.
sometimes just the illicit market. So you have the state legal marijuana. You have now state legal and arguably federally legal hemp, and that market, there are markets for that. I don't mean to suggest it's just one, but if you look at the national revenue, it's billions of dollars. It's become significant. And then you have the federally legal pipeline, if you will. And that's the registered, DEA registered growers, manufacturers, researchers, and presumably from that will be new drugs. You mentioned a formulation for sleep. You and I have talked about that. And those are out there. I mean, they're actually great, right? I mean, if you formulate, it seems, and I don't mean to suggest I have the precise number, and the numbers may change for different individuals. Maybe we'll have better study of that. But, some THC, a good amount of THC, some CBN and some CBD seem to really help people fall and stay asleep. And what I would hope is that through the more rigorous process and through capital being put into the more rigorous testing process, that this new FDA side of the market, DEA, FDA, federally legal side of the market, will help unleash the power of cannabis, right? I mean, we're all using it very successfully for different things. And what a lot of it's trial and error, right? I mean, people find like, gee, Jack Herrera does this for me and it helps me in this way, and we don't fully understand why. And the scientists will be able to hopefully figure that out and design better cannabinoid-based drugs for our health and well-being. And I'm not saying that can only happen on the federal side. It's clearly happening on the state side, but I think there can be really directed effort on that through the federal side.
And to on that topic, it sounds like what the federal agencies are creating is a pathway to medical R&D. And,
Yes.
they're going to need quality inputs for that medical R&D. And so, in working with attorneys and law firms like yours and Dentons, like you and Dentons, there could be ways for the existing companies to approach that market, as long as
Yeah.
they're doing it for that purpose in mind. And that opens up. My parents are both physicians, as I mentioned to you, and they have to go by the research they're seeing, and then the research
Right.
in the U.S. is top of the pile when it comes to that. And obviously, there's a whole mechanism in the pharma industry that works around that. So it sounds like the federal government is creating a initial step here to take the raw kind of material and the cannabinoids and start putting that towards actual research. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but then they would control international trade in that sense. The people who get approved at the federal level are the only ones that are going to be able to import export, unless I'm jumping too far ahead in terms of speculating there.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah, that's correct. That the DEA registered companies, individuals will be the ones who can handle it's THC, really, right? And so if I want to be clear that there still can be imports on non-THC cannabinoids.
Sure.
And what ends up being defined as hemp can be brought in. So theoretically, you can be bringing in, CBN. And let's just take that as an example, right? Your company sells or will sell a sleep gummy,
Sure.
and it contains THC, CBD, CBN. I don't, we're just hypothetical. It doesn't have to be about yours. So, and a company decides, golly, ours is selling great. We're doing volume. We can actually import CBN, pure CBN isolate, let's say, and it's clean and it doesn't have any THC, and we're going to then use it into our formulas.
Sure.
Well, that gets into a really interesting idea. Let's say you're just able to do that cheaper than you can source it in the United States, or that you can grow it yourself. And so from a federal level, that's legal. You're importing hemp. Different states have different views as to whether you can take inputs from outside the state and bring it in. And different states have different views as to whether any cannabis or cannabinoids can exist outside the state regulated program. So I'm just saying that theoretically can happen, but the state by state analysis is something we still need to engage in. When you're talking about like marijuana biomass, and let's say, my goodness, we can get marijuana biomass at pennies on the dollar in Uganda, and import the oil. And let's just think of it as like the crude oil, right? They're just have the machines there to do the full extraction, they ship it back. If that crude oil itself is expressing greater than 0.3% delta 9 THC by dry weight, it's considered marijuana. It's not hemp, and that would only be able to be imported by the DEA registered, both manufacturers or researchers. not the state legal companies.
So they're not going to change the Farm Bill Act, which created the ability for CBD to be, traded federally. And I'm messing up the name there, but what it's going to do is you could potentially, if you're registered, you could be kind of a participant in that importing. And then if you have any THC products that have more than that 0.03%, in order to export it, you would have to be DEA registered, and it would kind of then be tied into that UN paradigm that you were talking about.
Yeah, that's correct. And I just want to point out the importance of one thing you said, which is the Farm Bill.
Yep.
So the Farm Bill, everyone understood it was creating CBD, and taking CBD and hemp-derived CBD off of controlled substances. The bill itself, as it applies to hemp, defines hemp as cannabis sativa L and its extracts, derivatives, and isomers, all with no greater than 0.3% delta 9 THC. It also provides for pre-harvest, within that 30-day to be tested, and there has to be the inclusion in the formula of THCA. So if you're just growing normal weed and it happens to express no greater than 0.3% delta 9 THC, it still can be cannabis because you have to include the THCA. But after harvest, the definition only looks at the delta 9 THC. So we did not have a farm bill last year. There was no farm bill as anticipated. And in fact, the farm bill has again been kicked from 2024 to 2025. Recently, there were two dueling versions of the farm bill issued by the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans had some relief for farmers. It has some leeway, particularly if you were farming hemp for industrial purposes, not consumer purposes. The Democrat version really didn't say anything about hemp. And so the great question is, what happens with this so-called loophole?
Right.
What happens to hemp? It won't happen this year, it'll happen next year, but it has implications for what you were talking about.
And on that topic, could you talk about where do all of these, products that are out there, these synthetics and other, and you have a great term for it, if you could kind of cover these other kind of intoxicants that are out there, being sold in convenience stores and gas stations across the country. How does that all fit in with what's happening?
So two things. Number one, just to make very clear for your viewers, I mean, just so this is absolutely clear, that the rescheduling of cannabis to Schedule 3, both in its sort of form that it's progressing, and even when it becomes final, the state legal operators will continue to be illegal federally.
Right.
And that won't change anytime soon. I mean, they would now, instead of selling an illegal drug illegally, would be selling a legal controlled substance illegally.
Right.
So it doesn't change for them. In terms of the hemp industry, if you will, and particularly consumer hemp products, the rescheduling to 3 also doesn't change that. Those products are arguably defined as hemp, and hemp is entirely outside the Controlled Substances Act. And interestingly enough, those products, the USDA looks at those products and says, we have ag is what I'm saying. Ag looks at those products post harvest and says, we have no authority over that. And the DEA looks at them and says, as long as they're lower than 0.3% delta 9 THC, we don't really look at them. So the rescheduling to Schedule 3 itself would not impact that hemp intoxicant market. That said, I think it's at least possible that the DEA, when it issues these rules or sometime thereafter, would clarify what it considers to be hemp and what it considers to be the controlled, the Schedule 3 controlled substance. And maybe at that point would say, if you're using any sort of a chemical process to create the Delta 8 THC, or from CBD to create Delta 9 THC, that we consider that to be marijuana.
Right.
That if you're actually doing that process, it becomes marijuana, it's forever marijuana. They could say, with respect to extracts, that if it's not, part of a continual process, right? It's not part of the continual chemistry where you then bring it back down to a compliant hemp product, that anytime, you have a product that exceeds 0.3% Delta 9 THC, it becomes marijuana, and it thereafter is forever marijuana. I'm not saying that I think that's the right interpretation of the law. I'm just saying that they theoretically could do something like that. They also could do nothing. They could just have the rescheduling and the rules around compliance with the single convention and say nothing about any of this. And we'll continue to operate in this uncertain world with hemp derived intoxicating products out in the market. Excuse me. The DEA may also just say it's up to the states, right? I mean, we look at it and it says 0.3% and it's up to the states. And indeed, the states are legislating on this. And more states are legislating or have bills on intoxicating hemp products. More and more states are limiting dosage or pushing those sorts of products into the state legal cannabis programs.
Yep, that is that's interesting. So just to summarize some of the key points here,
Sure.
one of the questions that I get a lot, and I have to think through as being CFO for Nova Farms, is when does 280E go away? For example, the biggest financial boost to most companies, and you could be profitable like Nova is, or you could be, behind on your taxes and not profitable, and you're kind of waiting. And there's been a good amount of news about companies getting, reimbursed by the IRS on some of those taxes, right? So, could you talk about 280E? Your thoughts, kind of how does this create a framework? Because if we go back to the timeline we were discussing, and look, you're not an accountant, and neither am I, so we're not qualified to kind of even speculate on some of the tax implications. But how soon could 280E kind of go away if this all goes swimmingly, and would that be a given for the cannabis companies? Because we have tiers of illicit now, right? We have the legacy market, we have the state legal federal illicit market that they're creating basically out of this, and then you've got the DEA registered legal market, right? So how does 280E factor into all that?
Sure, and I'm glad that you raised that. It's on everyone's mind. So what is clear under the law is that, let's just say tomorrow, the DEA issued a final rule moving marijuana as it's defined as Schedule 3. Very clearly at that date, at least, 280 would not apply. I think it doesn't apply much earlier than that, but I'm just saying very clearly by the language, it would not apply at that time. And the reason is the 280 tax code section 280 itself on its face applies to the illegal sale of Schedule 1 or 2 drugs.
Right.
That's it. And so if and when marijuana is rescheduled to Schedule 3, the state legal operators and even the wholly illicit operators would no longer be selling a Schedule 1 or 2 drug. They would be selling a Schedule 3 drug, and therefore 280 would not apply to the state legal operators or even to the wholly illicit operators who are supposed to be paying their taxes. I mean, obviously many wholly illegal operators don't, but even if you have an illegal business, you're supposed to pay your taxes in the United States. And so 280E would no longer apply at the point that a final rule is issued. I would argue that it certainly doesn't apply in the year that a final rule is issued, but I would go one step further and argue that it can't apply even now, because the FDA's report and everything we know shows that marijuana cannot rationally be kept as a Schedule 1 drug. And so I would say that 280 no longer applies. And I think it goes back a bit, and we are able to issue a tax opinion that provides that comfort to companies who are taking those deductions now. Now, let me just make a clarification. As I understand it, the IRS has not approved anyone's theory for a refund yet. I know some of these announcements have gone to market saying we have a refund. I mean, my understanding is they've taken a refund, right? I mean, they basically have taken that position, and it doesn't mean that the IRS has approved that position. And there are various different theories that companies have used, as best I understand, to be able to claim that 280 does not apply to some or all of their operations and sales. And I'm not going to opine on that today. What I will say is that Dentons, we do have a legal opinion that folks can use to claim that 280 no longer applies, even though the final rule has not been issued yet.
Understood. So I guess, in kind of thinking through what we've discussed today, the next real step is for the OMB to reply back to the DEA. We're speculating as to when that will happen, but likely relatively quickly, because I'm sure they've been in touch as things have progressed between the FDA and the DEA, and it's not like hopefully they've been sitting in a vacuum waiting for something to come through and then opine on it. Could you talk about Dentons for a moment and how you work with clients, and what are some of the areas you think are going to be the key areas that you're going to be advising on as things move forward, to summarize our conversation today?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, this issue of rescheduling has been important over the last couple of weeks, and it remains important on everyone's mind to understand that. And there's a lot of legal and strategic decisions to be made around that. We are spending a lot of time talking about 280E and talking about tax and talking about 280 tax mitigation strategies. Not only that tax opinion, but we've been doing work on forming ESOPs that provide some relief in this area, and other work. As we've discussed, we spend a lot of time helping companies see around corners, right? I mean, what's coming up and how do you position your company correctly? And so keeping an eye on rescheduling, on SAFER, on anything else the federal government will do, but critically what the states are doing, right? And keeping totally abreast of everything the state's doing so that we can advise our clients on compliance in all areas. We also mentioned hemp. We're spending a lot of time advising clients on hemp. And when I say that, I don't mean just like the company that's all of a sudden gone online and selling D8 vapes or whatever it would be. I mean, there are so many companies that are impacted by that expanding market and want to understand it, whether they are, beyond the hemp specific companies, there are state legal cannabis companies that want to understand that. The banks and financial institutions and public exchanges want to understand what's going on with hemp and what's likely to go on with hemp. So it just goes on from there. You have brands all of a sudden that are interested in this area. There's definitely a lot. And then I'd say making sure that this industry is properly capitalized is important to me. And so it's been an uncomfortable position because the industry is not currently adequately capitalized. And the work we do is the legal work to get additional capital into the industry in terms of investments, equity investments, and other kinds of investments, as as well as debt financing. And then you just have M&A activity. And so we've been doing a ton of work on that. And then I should say, we've done so much work with companies that are publicly listed and working with NASDAQ and to a lesser degree, New York Stock Exchange, as well as the international exchanges, and trying to keep companies listed as they navigate the cannabis space. Because the companies that are listed have to be in compliance with all applicable laws. So a lot of the work we've done is structuring companies to get or remain listed, and compliance work to help them be compliant and remain listed. That's a lot of the work we're doing right now. I mean, it's just an interesting snapshot of what's taking time in the industry.
One quick question related to that, and I'll kind of wrap it up there for the audience. But what's going on with safer banking? Is it called Safest yet? And is it going to pass? And how does any of this news, rescheduling or potential progress in federal level banking opening up? Because you mentioned that if rescheduling happens, it does not mean the state legal players are going to have now access to federal, greenlit capital, right? Because that's a separate topic. It's not covered in this. But how? First of all, how does rescheduling and what's the state of safer banking, I guess, is the first one. And then secondly, what are the options for companies that are private like Nova Farms in terms of looking forward at potentially going public? What does that landscape look like? What would need to pass to make it easy to list on the New York Stock Exchange and stay compliant?
So safer would be good for the industry. I mean, it would be great for public safety, right? I mean, just let's acknowledge that getting that kind of cash out of that circulation in that context would be a good thing to do. And anyone looking at that would say, from a sensible public policy perspective, that safer ought to be passed.
And you're talking
and it would be
for newer viewers, you're talking about the fact that in the cannabis industry, everything is cash based and is being transported, on a cash basis.
a lot of cash. Yeah, there's a lot more cash in the cannabis industry than in other industries, because a lot of the mainstream financial institutions are not willing to handle cannabis cash. They view it as potential or an actual money laundering violation, or potentially a violation of the Bank Secrecy Act, even though FinCEN has provided guidance as to how to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act. So to be able to get deposit services through Safer would be phenomenal for everyone involved. For the industry itself, having proceeds from the industry no longer be proceeds of a crime for money laundering would be great, right? I mean, because I know a lot of investors and financial institutions are hesitant to get into the industry because they say the money that we're getting, they're proceeds of crime for money laundering. And Safer would remove that as well. And I'm not going to give a full summary of Safer other than say, it would be good for the industry, but it does not legalize the underlying conduct. And because it does not legalize the underlying conduct, and its current version, as I understand it, does not contain a safe harbor for the public exchanges, your company would not be able to immediately get listed on any of the US public exchanges. It would still be considered an illegal company. Now, you've seen various companies get listings on TSX, for example,
Sure.
like Cureleaf or TerraSend. And there are structures like that that theoretically would be easier with Safer passed, but it doesn't create the legality that would, or the protections that would allow you to get listed on the public exchange, you meaning your company.
Sure.
Unfortunately, not yet. So it would be an incremental change. It also contained something the Republicans wanted very much in Section 10, which is to what it basically does say to the banks, you cannot deny services based on ideology, right? You can't say this is a company that's anti-abortion, or this is a petroleum company. We just don't like that and we don't want to do business with that. basically our elected officials are saying if we're going to permit marijuana to get banked, you have to, banks can't pull away from these other industries. So there's tremendous interest and support in the act. I also think it faces various challenges. Number one, Senator McConnell has said he's not willing to agree for SAFER to be included in FAA, right? And basically what he's saying is we're not going to put this in some must-pass legislation that it has no relationship to. And so that's difficult. I think there's a mentality that passing that bill would give Joe Biden a win. And there are plenty of folks who say, yes, I think this is a good idea. Yes, my constituents want this and would want me to vote for it, but it's not significant enough, and I can't give a win to President Biden. So I think there is a path forward for it. It's gotten more narrow, and I am not optimistic that SAFER will get passed this year.
Got it. Okay. Well, I don't want to leave on a down note, but
but there's a ton of good things happening, right? I mean, there really is, and we're looking at whether Florida will legalize, and we're seeing much greater optimism about the industry. And the bottom line is, Section 3 is very incremental. It doesn't cure the ills, but it certainly shows a path forward for folks. And that notion that this is a dangerous drug that has no medicinal uses has been dispelled. And that the fact that we find, well, it had been for a long time, but the fact that we finally have the government buy into that notion is really important. Is more monumental than the other things that we talked about, which are more moments in time.
absolutely.
Long time. I know they affect businesses. I don't mean to be callous with that, but I mean, when we're looking back on this 50 years later, these, a year or 2 years or 3 years feels like less time.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I've been in this industry for over 8 years now. So, each year flies by. And I'll say this, for looking at from a capital kind of perspective, the amount of interest I've seen coming inbound is, pretty incredible, just because it's a different paradigm. Patients can go to their doctors and be able to talk about it as a medicine instead of a highly addictive drug. Investors have been kind of circling around for some time, waiting for movement on the regulatory front, and this is a pretty significant one. The R&D valve opening up and actual data in the U.S., while it'll take time to develop that, will start to come through. And you could see that in the public companies and their valuations when the news came out. So at the end of the day, it still depends on how well you operate those companies and how profitable you can be and how you keep debt under control and use it for growth. But it's exciting times, and it's the most exciting I've seen it in years, especially given the drought of capital in the last couple of years in this industry. So
excellent. Well said. Yeah, agreed.
I thank you, Eric, for your time. As always, I could keep talking to you for the rest of the day, but then you wouldn't be able to go back to servicing your clients. But thank you for all of your work and for explaining all of these various interconnected and kind of puzzle pieces in this industry for me and the viewers.
Yeah, really nice to speak with you. I enjoy the opportunity. And if any of your viewers have questions, I'm happy to speak with them as well.
And how can they reach you, Eric, to do?
Email is best for me, eric.berlin@dentons.com.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate your time and look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you, Anand.